hope, ye who enter here.
I do not know for sure where they originated. I have been told several things from Western North Carolina locals. Escaped mental patients, government experiments gone wrong, people from the Depression era who decided living in the hills would be better than the life they were living, and so on. Who knows? I've never focused too much on their origins because, well, how could it ever be verified? I refuse to be one of those guys who claim to have all the answers. However, one thing for sure I'm certain of is that the United States government is aware of these Appalachian feral men. I have often wondered myself if these feral wild men are not men at all but creatures. These feral men could be so feral that they may have more of a beast-like origin. I just do not know. Things I am certain of is that they do have a great tunnel system within our hills and mountains. They will kidnap people, and they are completely feral. They will kidnap people, but they go for children or the elderly. They will eat people, then toss their bones wherever. They will do the same to animals, especially deer. Their trapdoor systems are profoundly intelligent to where people are literally falling into them while hiking in the woods. I'd like to add that the feral men are only in wooded areas of the hills and mountains. You will not find them in natural rocky areas, so I do not account for all the disappearances in rock climbing areas to be feral wild men. The population of the feral wild men has decreased throughout the years. In the case of Dennis Martin, after locals and forest rangers failed to locate them, the Green Beret came in and took over, telling local authorities to stop their own search. The Green Berets stayed in those woods for 10 days, I believe. It was stated that they took the time and killed all of the feral wild men that they could find in that area, and the boys' remains were indeed found by the military. We know the government has done some work in depleting their population. It's believed they do have their own way of communicating with one another, and have developed packs. They avoid being spotted by mostly staying underground, but they tend to scope out areas by hiding above in the trees. I've said before, to look up and not down when in the woods. People never think to look above them. The trees are great hiding places. You will find few people here and there who have spotted a feral wild man. Getting them to talk about it in detail is like pulling teeth. Stories and sightings of the feral wild men are kept tight within families and locals of the Appalachian, just as my grandfather told my father and then passed on to me. But I'm not someone who can keep my mouth shut. I went on a family vacation to the Great Smoky Mountains. I'm not sure the month, but it was in the spring. We had been there a few days, exploring just everywhere. This is something we had done every year, but this year, it turned out to be very different. It was the day before we were to leave and head back home. My dad decided we would take a walk down the trails and streams. We were at Deep Creek Loop Trail. My dad had taken his fishing pole. Dad, Mum, my brother and myself were walking by a stream. My brother and I kind of walked away from the stream, a little ways off trail into the woods. I'm not sure how far we were from our parents. I do know I couldn't see them anymore. I don't remember if my brother or myself saw it first. From a side view, my first thought was an animal because of movement in the trees, so being very quiet, we stepped to the side by a tree to hide and to be able to watch it. What I thought was an animal was indeed not. It heard us and turned towards us. What I saw was horrifying. It was bent over, devouring a dead animal, possibly a deer. It was tearing its guts out and eating it. It had bloody hands, face and chest. I saw enough to know it wasn't an animal, but dear God, it wasn't a man either. It had bloody flesh hanging from its mouth and hands. It had a large forehead that looked like it had knots. It was very hairy, but not as hairy as a bear or a Bigfoot. And between the blood, the skin looked dirty. It was a deformed man. We were so scared my brother took off running first, then I followed. I turned for just a second to see if it was coming after us. As I was turning to run, also it took off running the other way. It didn't stand up totally straight, but I could tell it was male. By what I saw, it was at least 6 feet tall, and may have been taller. Since he didn't stand up straight, it was hard to tell. He was pretty thick. Me was how it looked like a human male and creature mix. I could also smell an odor that was like flesh and garbage. We ran back to my parents and told them. My dad at first thought we might have been trying to pull a prank on him. He played along and walked back to where we had came from. A minute later, he came back and said to us,
"We have to go. Now."
His face was pale, like he lost all his color. We did go to a ranger and told him everything. He said he was going to call another ranger and they would look into it. He thanked us and we drove off. That was our last visit there. I had nightmares for a while, but I never spoke about it to anyone. I still do not know what we saw, but this was a man that was mixed with monster. In May 2019, me and my husband Jay were visiting the North Carolina mountains to celebrate his birthday. We had just planned a drive to go sightseeing for a couple of days, but then decided to take a walk down the Pigeon Creek Trail at Mingo Falls. A friend had told us about the waterfalls. We got there early, around 8:45, and there were no cars or people. We parked and started the walk up the long steps. When we arrived at the waterfall, we immediately saw a monster. It was a wild man, and he was naked and had bushy body hair. His face was deformed and lumpy, skinny but tall, and we could see his chest. His ribs were sticking out. The bottom half of the naked body was more hairy than the top half. The arms looked longer than they should have been. Odd-shaped head. My husband described him as being mangled and deformed. I said, "James, what is that up there?" And as soon as I said that, we both started smelling something awful like garbage and vomit. We stared at him a second, and we saw the man's eyes were white and cloudy, like he had cataracts. He seemed evil and startled that we saw him. He was just standing there. The thing was carrying an old blanket in its hand, and it dragged into the water. Like a little child's blanket, because we saw colors on the blanket, but the blanket was wet and dirty. We watched him a second, and then he crouched down at the top of the waterfall and disappeared into it, as if it dropped down into some bunker. We turned around and went back to our car, and continued to look around us. We were scared. We know it was not a Bigfoot, and we know it was a man because we saw the man's uncircumcised penis. The legs were all wet too because all his leg hair was wet. It was about 6.5 feet tall. Hairy, but we could see his skin under the hair. Saw his chest and ribs. It was like a hairy, deformed and mangled man. Cloudy white eyes, big hands. He had full dark facial hair, but looked a little bald on top of its head, with long strands of hair too. We were going to check out the casino in Cherokee, North Carolina later that day, but we decided to go home after that. We believe it was a wild man. I live in West Virginia and have all my life. I don't come from a rich family and am not rich myself. I live in a small, single-wide trailer with my 2-year-old son outside of the town of Gary. My boyfriend is a truck driver and is only home every so often. I'm kinda used to being alone with my son here at night. My closest neighbor is 3 miles and my trailer is back in the woods. This is a mountain town. I grew up hearing scary stories of monsters, but I never saw anything growing up. I never saw anything until now, and I want to tell you about it. So, this all started last summer. I clean houses for a living and was leaving the last house of the day and had just picked up my son from the babysitters, and we were headed back home. It was 8 p.m. exactly when we turned in the driveway. My driveway is a very long sand driveway, surrounded by trees and the woods on both sides. I hadn't even got to my house when I saw a man jump from one tree on the right side of the driveway to a tree on the left side of the driveway. I mean, like 30 feet in the air. He just jumped like how a monkey swings from trees. He did this in front of the car as I was still driving slow to get to the trailer. It's bumpy sand on the driveway, so I never go more than 10 miles per hour down it. At that moment, I wasn't sure what I saw, but I did know it was a man. I saw its skin and it had some torn cloth on it too. Arms, legs, all of that a man would have. I did not see its face. I hit my brakes. My son is still in the back seat, almost asleep. I didn't question what I saw or try to make sense of it because I know it was some creature. Yes, I was scared. My first thought was my son. I only stopped there in my driveway for a second and then went ahead and sped up to go on and get down the driveway so I could get in the house with my son. I'm passing those trees to my left and I'm looking around to see if it's there. I don't see nothing. I just keep going. It's about dark, but I can still see. I see my trailer around the corner up ahead, and I see movement. Okay, so let me add here that it's not uncommon for some deers or other animals to be around the trailer. That's normal. But there was people up ahead, and one of them was in my trash bag. I don't have trash service way out here, so sometimes I will sit a bag of trash on my porch and haul it myself to the dump. So a man was all in my trash. I get closer and these people hear my car, and my headlights are lighting up the front area of my house. I see like 4 of these things run off into the woods. I saw one of them real good. But it was his face that really got me scared. That thing had dirt or mud all over his face, and there was something wrong with his face because it didn't look right to me. His eyes were way up on his forehead, and it had this humpback. It had some dark pants on but no shirt, and the chest and back had a lot of brown hair. His nipples were huge and dark, and I could see it through the hair. His feet were bare. This was the one digging in my trash bag. He ran off too, but he didn't seem to be in as much of a hurry as the other ones were to get back to the woods. I lost sight of them all and I waited before I went any further because of my son. I didn't have no gun or anything on me, so I was careful. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, running idle before I drove on up to the house. I grabbed my son and we ran inside, and because of no cell signal down my driveway, I called my uncle once I got inside. My uncle said I was seeing shit, but he came on out there an hour later and looked around. I was so scared while me and my son sat here waiting for my uncle. My uncle got here. He's a big guy and had weapons on him. He investigated. He came back to the front door, white as a ghost. He came in and said he saw the devil in those woods, and that we were getting in his truck with my son and getting the hell out of here. We never called the police or nothing. That was last summer. The winter came and nothing. Then this past March, when my boyfriend was home, we hear scratching at 11 at night on the side of the trailer. A metal sound. He went outside to look, but there wasn't anything there. But he smelled a smell that he described as rotten pig feet. If you eat pig feet, then you know what I mean. We smell bad things a lot, and we see things moving in the trees. But now, my boyfriend will be moving us to another state because of his job, and we only have a few more weeks. But there are some wild clans in West Virginia too, not just in North Carolina and Tennessee. And no, my uncle never talked about it ever, what he's seen. Thank you. Cherokee, North Carolina. My wife and I went to the mountains a few summers ago. We sat our camper up off a public trail, off the Great Smoky Mountain Parkway, 15 minutes outside of Cherokee. It was about 4 a.m. and I had to use the restroom. I won't explain why the commode in our camper wasn't working, that caused me to have to go outside and piss at the campsite public outhouse. I'm in my 60s and I just can't hold my bladder like I used to. I didn't want to go outside, but I did. I remember it being real hot outside and humid. Even at 4 in the morning, it was very sticky outside. It was dark, hot, and all I could hear around me were bugs and frogs. I walked the short distance to the little wood building that held the commode. There was a string you pull up above you to turn on the single light bulb. After I finished, I walked out of the building and looked towards the camper. Sweet God Almighty, there's this thing standing by my camper door. It had long frizzled up hair, and the bones in its shoulders and forehead protruded out like its bones and scalp plate were broken. It looked like a man that had been tossed in a meat grinder. It was naked, and I mean pure naked. It had a penis. And I saw the kneecaps, and they looked all messed up too. Like they had been smashed on and were swollen or something. It had very hairy arms and legs, but that was it, besides the long hair on its head. But there was still even a balding spot right in the center of the head. So it saw me and I saw it, staring right at each other. I swear to God, all those bugs and frogs I heard, gone. No sound. No sound. Quiet as a mouse in those woods. It was so quiet I could hear its breathing. And I don't mean to be sad, but you know when someone is about to pass away and they have this gurgle, fish out of the water breathing? Well, that's how it was breathing. A rasp to it. This thing stood at my camper door, and I was terrified it was about to walk in to my sleeping wife. The camper had 2 solar lights in front that lit up this thing. I watched it turn and I watched him slowly walk into the woodline until he disappeared from my sight. But in his hand was a dead rabbit. I think it was a rabbit. He was just holding on to it. Well, I mentioned my bladder because I won't even lie. I pissed on myself. Standing right there. I don't know where it came from because I just got done in the bathroom. But I did. I pissed on myself in terror. I ran to the camper, and when I got to the front door, I smelt a very bad smell. I opened the door and locked it. I stayed awake until daybreak, looking at the side window towards that tree line. I told my wife 3 months later. She was the one who... Oops. Can you explain what I saw? It was a man. I didn't mention, that smell still lingers at my camper door. Even now, I can smell it. I've bleached it and everything. Rotting flesh, if you ask me. I'm in West North Carolina, right outside the Great Smoky Mountains. I'm not sure if I've had any encounters with the wild men. I did hear something scream once, close by in the woods, sometime after midnight, but assumed it was a bobcat. But I've heard rumors and old wives' tales my whole life about them, and I can confirm there was at least one out there. My wife is from a very rural part of the county, right on the Tennessee state line. As we say around here, they're so far out they have to pipe in sunshine. Over an hour to get to town, and that's using the interstate for most of the way. Go the long way and it's more like an hour and 45 minutes. Her family is one of the original families that settled there in the 1830s or shortly after. In that area, everybody's related to everybody else in some way or another. And the only way I can describe the folks there is that they are clannish. Maybe an outdated word, but it's the most apt description I can give. They don't trust outsiders easily. They don't talk much to anyone who wasn't born there or lived there at least 10 years. Like I said, I've heard stories my whole life about the wild men, but one in particular was always distinguished from the others because he had a nickname, the wild man of a certain valley. Everybody knew at least one person who had seen him while out hiking, fishing or camping, and they all said the same thing. He had a long grey beard nearly to his waist, long grey hair, was dressed in ragged overalls with no shirt, and went barefoot. As soon as he realized you had seen him, he turned and ran, seeming to disappear in just a few yards. So far, the description matches the feral wild men that we discuss here, right? My wife and I had been together probably a year or so when I randomly thought of the stories of that wild man. Since she was born and raised there, and her families go back to the settling of the area, I asked her if she had ever seen him, or knew anything about him. She laughed and said, "Of course I've seen him. He's my uncle." Actually, he was her great-uncle, in his 70s at the time. He was always a quiet and private person, and in his early 20s he packed a few things, walked out into the wilds, and built a little one-room cabin, built in true pioneer style by hand with only hand tools. He was far from any other people, a couple of hours' hike from her house. Seldomly he would come and visit her dad, to trade for a few staple foods and get news of the family. Maybe an hour later he'd be gone again. Her dad was the only person he would visit. My wife said he didn't like or trust anybody else as much as her dad. He died maybe 5 or 6 years ago. There was a big winter storm headed our way. My wife's dad hiked out to see if her uncle wanted to come stay at his house until it was over. Her uncle refused. He said he had everything he needed and he would be just fine. The storm was pretty bad, especially in that area because there's a large lake and they get more snow because of the moisture from it. It took about a week before it melted enough for her dad to check on her uncle. When her dad got there, sadly, the wild man had frozen to death. They buried him right by his house, knowing he would want to be by himself in death as he was in life. He was over 80 when he died. So there's proof for you that wild men can and do exist. Why couldn't the feral wild men we talk about here have started in a similar way? Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. As always, a big thank you to all of the Reddit users who kindly allowed me to use their stories. If you want to help support this channel, you will find links to both my Patreon and my Teespring store in the description below. So feel free to have a look. And the biggest thank you to all of you who continue to support me. I truly do appreciate it. And remember,
Papa loves you. Ha ha